Picture this, the year is 856, and the autumn fog drifted through the ancient forests like the breath of something long forgotten. Beyond the tree line, on waters as still as death itself, 40 Viking longships sat frozen in place. Not anchored, not resting. Frozen. Dragon-proud vessels that had crushed resistance from Byzantium to the frozen north now hung motionless, their oars suspended mid-stroke as if time itself had stopped. Not because of weather or tactical planning, but because of sound. A sound that reached into the chests of hardened warriors and squeezed their hearts until they forgot how to breathe. From deep within the forest came the bellowing of bulls, deep, resonant, impossible, mixed with war cries that seemed both human and utterly not. And beneath it all a rhythmic pounding. Axes striking shields, steady, deliberate. Making the very earth tremble with each beat. This wasn't supposed to happen. These were the same men who had made emperors kneel, who had turned the sight of their sails into a death omen across 3 continents. Jarl Eriksson the Merciless stood at his ship's prow with hands that trembled against the wood, not from cold, but from something his body recognized before his mind could name it. Pure animal terror. But before we reveal what broke the unbreakable Vikings, let's talk about the real villain of this story. And it's not the Bull Skull tribe. The real enemy is the arrogance of assumed superiority. The toxic belief that past victories guarantee future dominance. The dangerous delusion that reputation alone can substitute for adaptation. The Vikings had conquered so much for so long that they stopped questioning their own methods. They became prisoners of their own success, unable to recognize when the world had evolved beyond their understanding. They confused fame with invincibility, tradition with wisdom, and reputation with actual strength. Sound familiar? In our world, this same arrogance destroys businesses that refuse to innovate, leaders who stop listening, and individuals who coast on yesterday's achievements while tomorrow's challenges evolve. The Vikings teach us that the most dangerous enemy isn't external, it's the voice inside that whispers, "We've always done it this way and it's always worked." If you believe that real strength comes from constantly questioning your assumptions, from respecting enemies you don't understand, and from having the courage to retreat when pride demands you charge forward, then this story is your battle cry. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're about to explore the moment when history's greatest warriors discovered that their greatest weakness wasn't their enemy's strength. It was their own inability to imagine they could be wrong. The Bull Skull tribe is waiting, and unlike the Vikings, they've been patient for over 2,000 years. What could possibly make the most feared raiders in history freeze before even setting foot on shore? The answer stood at the forest's edge, emerging from the mist like something conjured from the darkest sagas. Warriors, but not like any warriors the Norse had ever faced. Their heads bore the massive bleached skulls of horned bulls, eye sockets glowing with reflected firelight. Their bodies were painted in patterns of deep red that seemed to pulse and writhe in the uncertain light. They carried double-bladed axes that caught the dawn light like fresh blood, and they weren't charging. They weren't defending. They were simply standing there watching as the rhythmic shield beating continued. Watching as if they had been waiting for this moment. Watching as if they already knew how this would end. The answer lies buried in these cursed forests, written in the broken minds of the few who survived, and whispered in the nightmares that would haunt the Viking world for generations to come. The intelligence had been flawless. Traders captured off the Irish coast had spoken of wealthy settlements nestled in the forest valleys, protected by nothing more than wooden palisades and farmers with hunting spears. Jarl Eriksson the Merciless had chosen his men carefully. 40 ships carrying 1,200 warriors who had seen blood from Constantinople to the frozen wastes of the north. These weren't desperate raiders or untested boys seeking glory. These were killers who had perfected their craft over decades of conquest. The landing should have been simple. beach the ships, form the shield wall, advance with overwhelming force. It was a formula that had never failed them. But as the first longships scraped against the shore, the silence pressed down on them like a physical weight. No cooking fires hastily extinguished. No panicked voices calling warnings. No mothers gathering children to flee inland. Just the sound of their own breathing and the occasional creak of leather armor. Erickson stepped onto the beach with his axe already drawn, scanning the tree line for movement. That's when he saw them. Not charging forward in desperate defense, not fleeing in terror, but simply standing at the forest's edge. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. It was impossible to tell because they seemed to shift and blur, their blood-red painted bodies blending seamlessly with the autumn leaves and shadow-dappled undergrowth. The bull skull masks turned slowly, tracking the Vikings' movements with unnatural precision. Behind those hollow eye sockets, Erickson felt something watching him. Not with anger or fear, but with the patient interest of a predator observing prey that didn't yet know it was being hunted. His second-in-command, a veteran named Thormod who had survived 12 major battles, leaned close and whispered, "Jarl, something is very wrong here. We should." "We should what?" Erickson snapped, though his own instincts were screaming the same warning. "Turn back before drawing blood, return home and tell them we ran from painted farmers." Pride was a chain around his neck, and it was tightening with every heartbeat. He ordered the advance. 300 men moved inland in tight formation, shields locked, weapons ready. The bull skull warriors melted back into the forest without resistance, disappearing so completely it was as if they had never been there at all. The Vikings found themselves walking through an abandoned village, fire pits still warm, tools laid neatly aside, food half prepared. But no people, no treasure, no enemy to fight. That's when the hunting began. The first man died without a sound. One moment he was walking in formation, the next his position was empty, just a smear of blood on fallen leaves and his weapon lying abandoned. Then another, then 3 more. The bull skull warriors didn't announce their attacks with war cries or challenges. They simply appeared from impossible angles, struck once with surgical precision, and vanished before retaliation was possible. Erickson tried to maintain order, but discipline crumbled when men couldn't see what was killing them. They spun in circles, slashing at shadows, their own fear becoming a weapon used against them. The forest seemed to shift and close in around them. Paths they had marked moments before vanished. Every tree looked identical. The sun disappeared behind a canopy that shouldn't have been so thick. By the time darkness fell on that first day, they had lost nearly 200 men without ever engaging in a proper battle. The survivors huddled together, torches casting dancing shadows that transformed every movement into potential death. The bull skull warriors didn't attack that night. They didn't need to. The Vikings could hear them in the darkness, the soft scrape of bone against bark, the rhythmic breathing that might have been wind through branches or might have been something else entirely. Dawn revealed their greatest horror. While the exhausted warriors had maintained their vigil, someone, or something, had arranged the bodies of their fallen comrades in a clearing not 50 paces from their defensive position. The corpses were laid out in a perfect spiral pattern, all facing inward, weapons placed ceremonially across their chests. It was a message written in the dead: "We could have killed you all while you slept. We chose not to." Think about what that means. Erickson found something else in that clearing that broke the last of his resolve. Half buried beneath moss and fallen leaves were the rusted remnants of Viking equipment, not from his expedition but older. Shields bearing clan symbols he recognized from stories his grandfather had told. Sword hilts corroded beyond use. A Thor's hammer amulet on a chain that had oxidized to powder. This wasn't the Bull Skull tribe's first encounter with Norse raiders. It was simply the latest. How many expeditions had come to these forests and never returned? How many times had the Vikings told themselves those crews had been lost to storms or misfortune, never suspecting the truth? When Ericsson gave the order to retreat, no one questioned it. They moved back to the ships in tight formation, every man's eyes scanning the forest edge. The bull skull warriors stood exactly where they had been that morning, watching in perfect silence as the Vikings dragged their longships into the water. As the oars bit into the waves and the shoreline receded, Ericsson looked back one final time. The warriors hadn't moved. They simply stood there, those hollow skull eyes tracking the fleeing ships until the mist swallowed them from view. Ericsson never spoke of what happened in those forests. Within a year, he was dead. No wounds, no illness, just a man who stopped eating and sleeping until his body finally gave out. His last words, whispered to the priest who attended his deathbed, were simple and terrible. "They're still watching me." 5 years after Ericsson's silent death, Orm Wolfsbane stood on the deck of his lead ship and studied the same cursed shoreline. He had heard the whispered stories, dismissed them as the ravings of broken men who had lost their nerve. Ericsson had failed because he was predictable, Orm told himself. The old Jarl had charged in with overwhelming force like every other raid, never considering that some enemies required a different approach. Orm's 15 ships carried 450 warriors, but these were specialists. Scouts who could move through hostile territory without detection, archers who could kill from shadows, men trained in the art of silent killing. They would land under the new moon when darkness was absolute, strike with surgical precision, and be gone before the Bull Skull tribe even knew they were there. It was the perfect plan. The advance scouts returned with news that should have sent them all back to the ships. They had found remains of a previous Viking expedition, 30 bodies arranged in a perfect circle in a forest clearing, all facing outward as if defending against something that had come from every direction at once. Their faces were locked in expressions of such pure terror that even hardened warriors had to look away. Their weapons were still in their hands, but showed no signs of use. Whatever had killed them had done so without a fight. Orm studied the scene and made his decision. Ericsson had failed because he fought during the day when the Bull Skull warriors could use the forest against him. The bodies proved that others had tried and failed with conventional tactics. But no one had tried what Orm was about to attempt, a ghost raid in and out before sunrise using darkness as an ally rather than an obstacle. He was wrong about so many things. The landing proceeded in perfect silence under a moonless sky. The Vikings moved inland in small groups of 10, each carrying torches that created islands of light in the absolute darkness. The plan was simple. Advance in a coordinated pattern, never losing sight of the neighboring groups, strike the nearest settlement, and retreat before dawn. But within an hour of entering the forest, that plan dissolved into nightmare. The first sound wasn't the attack, it was the drums. Deep, resonant beats that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating through their bones and making their teeth ache. Then came the bull calls, but wrong somehow, distorted and layered as if dozens of creatures were bellowing in unison from every direction at once. Underneath it all, rhythmic chanting in a language that predated words, sounds that bypassed thought and struck directly at the primitive part of the brain that remembered when humans were prey. The northern group went silent first. When Orm's men investigated, they found only the torches planted firmly in the ground, flames still burning, but no sign of the warriors who had carried them. No blood, no weapons, no bodies. Just empty forest and those accursed drums beating in the darkness. Then the southern group. Then the eastern. One by one, the islands of light winked out, leaving only screams that cut off so suddenly it was worse than if they had continued. Orm ordered everyone to fall back to the beach, to regroup and retreat while they still could. But the paths looked identical in every direction. They walked for what felt like hours, always finding themselves back at the same clearing, the same moss-covered stone, as if the forest itself was looping them in circles. That's when the Bull Skull warriors appeared at the edge of the torchlight. Not charging, not even threatening, just standing there, those hollow eye sockets reflecting the flames. One moment visible, solid, and real. The next moment gone as if they had been nothing more than shadows cast by flickering light. The Vikings slashed at empty air, their own panic becoming contagious. Then Orm heard his name. Not shouted as a challenge, but spoken softly in the darkness beyond the torches. In his own voice, perfect mimicry. Of every inflection and tone. Orm, it called. Orm Wolfsbane, where are you going? Other names followed, warriors hearing themselves called from the black spaces between trees, their own voices asking questions they had never spoken. The drumming grew louder, faster, until Orm realized with dawning horror that it was synchronizing with his heartbeat, matching it, controlling it. His pulse hammered against his ribs, driven by the rhythm of those unseen drums until he couldn't tell where the sound ended and his own body began. Nausea rolled through him in waves, his vision blurred. A bull skull warrior materialized directly in front of him, close enough that Orm could see the texture of the bone, the patterns carved into the skull's surface. The warrior didn't attack, didn't raise the massive axe held loosely in one hand. Instead, it leaned forward and exhaled slowly across Orm's face. The breath smelled like rich earth after rain, like ancient things buried deep and undisturbed, like the inside of burial mounds where time moved differently. Then it was gone, dissolved back into darkness as completely as if it had never existed. In that moment, Orm understood with crystalline clarity what Eriksson must have realized too late. They weren't being fought. They were being hunted. This wasn't war, it was sport. The bull skull warriors were showing them the same mercy a cat shows a mouse, letting them run and tire themselves before the inevitable end. Dawn came with shocking suddenness. Orm found himself standing on the beach with no memory of how he had gotten there. Around him, scattered survivors emerged from the tree line, their faces slack with incomprehension. 300 men were missing. Their bodies were never found. The longships had been pushed back into the water by hands unknown, sitting ready for departure as if the forest itself was eager to be rid of them. Orm tried to grip his axe for the voyage home, but his hands trembled so violently the weapon clattered to the deck. They would never stop shaking. For the rest of his life, whenever he tried to hold a blade, his body would remember that night and refuse to obey. Other survivors fared no better. Some woke screaming from dreams of being chased by shadows with glowing eyes. Others found themselves unable to enter even small groves of trees without their hearts racing and breath coming in gasps. They had survived, but they would never be warriors again. The Bull Skull tribe had taken something more valuable than their lives. They had taken their ability to fight back. 10 years after Orm Wolfsbane's hands began their eternal trembling, Sigurd the Wise stood in a monastery library studying texts that most Jarls couldn't even read. He had spent months gathering accounts from every failed expedition, consulting with priests about spiritual warfare, even traveling to speak with Celtic scholars who knew the old ways. In a cave system 3 days inland, he found his answer: paintings that predated memory itself, showing bull-headed warriors defeating armies in bronze, in iron, in Roman steel. The Bull Skull tribe had been defending these forests for over 2,000 years. Sigurd understood what his predecessors had not. This wasn't about tactics or timing or individual courage. This was about preparation, overwhelming force, and breaking the psychological hold these warriors maintained. He assembled 100 ships carrying 3,000 men, the largest raiding force ever gathered for a single target. He brought runecasters to counter spiritual attacks, priests to maintain morale, and scholars to document everything. They would establish a fortified beachhead, advance in disciplined formations, and crush this mystery through sheer unstoppable numbers. The landing proceeded without opposition. Vikings constructed a proper fort with earthen walls and watchtowers, supply lines organized, rotation schedules maintained. For 3 days nothing happened. No attacks, no sounds, not even a glimpse of the enemy. Some men began to relax, joking that the stories had been exaggerated, that the bull skull warriors had fled before such an overwhelming display of force. On the fourth night, the drumming began, but this was different from what Orm's men had described. This wasn't the rapid heartbeat rhythm meant to disorient. This was something older, deeper, fundamental. Each beat made the ground vibrate, sent ripples through water containers, caused small stones to dance and rearrange themselves. It was the pulse of the earth itself, and it was accelerating. Dawn revealed an impossibility. The forest edge, which had been empty the previous evening, was now lined with bull skull warriors. Thousands of them. Far more than any settlement could support, far more than had ever been reported. They stood in perfect rank, stretching as far as the eye could see, each one identical in their bone masks and blood-red paint. Sigurd raised his viewing glass and felt. His certainty cracked like thin ice. Some of the warriors weren't entirely solid. Morning mist seemed to flow through them, giving their forms a translucent quality that shifted between substantial and ethereal. He was looking at something that transcended normal warfare. These weren't just living defenders. They were the accumulated spirits of every bull skull warrior who had ever stood on this ground, called forth by a threat worthy of their collective presence. Sigurd gave the order to advance because 3,000 men were watching and waiting, and he couldn't show the doubt that was consuming him. The Vikings moved forward in textbook formation, shields locked, discipline maintained. The bull skull warriors met them with silent efficiency. Every warrior that fell was stepped over by two more. Every gap in their lines filled instantly. They fought with a coordination that suggested a single consciousness distributed across thousands of bodies. Then the forest began to move, not with wind or natural growth but with purpose. Trees that had been distant landmarks shifted position, blocking retreat paths. The ground beneath Viking feet became soft and grasping, turning each step into a struggle. Roots emerged to trip and entangle. The path back to the beach, marked, mapped, and clearly visible an hour ago, simply ceased to exist. Sigurd watched his perfect strategy dissolve and finally understood the truth that had destroyed Eriksson and Orm. The Bull Skull tribe wasn't an army occupying territory. They were the territory's response to invasion, the living immune system of a land that had been pushed too far. You couldn't defeat them any more than you could defeat winter or the tide. They weren't conquerors because they didn't need to conquer. They simply were, eternal and inevitable. The chief bull warrior separated from the mass and walked towards Sigurd alone, unarmed. The fighting continued around them, but these two existed in a bubble of terrible clarity. The chief reached up and removed his skull mask. Beneath was the face of an ordinary man, weathered and middle-aged, but his eyes held a sadness that seemed to span centuries. He spoke in perfect Norse, his voice tired and ancient. "We did not choose this burden. The land chose us generations ago when the first invaders came. We are its memory, its defense, its warning. You see thousands of us because you brought thousands of threats. We are only ever as many as we need to be." He gestured to the battle, to the impossible numbers, to the forest that had become a living barrier. Your people raid for glory, for wealth, for stories to tell in warm halls. We defend because we must. Because something must answer when balance is broken. Sigurd found himself unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen as this ancient guardian continued. Every century someone like you comes. Someone who believes preparation and force can overcome what we are. They always leave, or they don't leave at all. The land remembers them either way. When dawn came again, the Vikings found themselves back at their ships, which sat ready and provisioned as if invisible hands had prepared them for departure. 3,000 warriors climbed aboard in absolute silence, their eyes holding the hollow look of men who had seen behind the veil of the world and found something they could never unknow. They had been allowed to leave, but the price was everything they had believed about themselves. Sigurd spent his remaining years in a monastery, writing warnings that most dismissed as the ravings of a broken old man. His final text, discovered after his death, read, "We Vikings conquered the world by believing we were the ultimate predators. But in those ancient forests, we learned the truth. We are not the top of the food chain. We never were. Some places have guardians that existed before humanity learned to speak, and they will exist long after our empires crumble to dust. The Bull-Skull tribe taught us this. Conquest is a human concept. Nature recognizes only balance, and when balance is threatened, nature responds. The Vikings raided everyone except this tribe not because they couldn't defeat them in battle, but because they finally encountered an enemy that couldn't be defeated. An enemy that was less a people and more a force of nature made manifest. The Bull Skull tribe won without needing victory, defended without needing aggression, and endured without needing glory. They simply were and are and will always be